Welcome to this episode of If Your Therapist Knew, where research meets relationship. This is episode 4 of our series on female autism and therapy, and today we arrive at the question the entire series has been building toward: what actually helps? Today we turn towards solutions, concrete, research-grounded, clinically specific answers to the question of what neurodiversity-affirming care actually looks like in practice. We'll explore how evidence-based modalities are being meaningfully adapted for autistic neurology. We'll talk about bottom-up approaches, executive functioning support, and advocacy. And we'll close by talking about something the medical model has rarely prioritized for this population: identity integration, authentic belonging, and what genuine healing actually looks like when it's defined by the client herself. This is a hopeful episode, not naively so, but grounded in the conviction that when we stop trying to fix a neurotype and start honoring a human being, something genuinely transformative becomes possible. Before we discuss any specific modality or intervention, we need to establish the organizing principle that underlies all of them, because it changes the entire sequence of therapeutic work. That principle is this: regulation before cognition. You cannot reason with a dysregulated nervous system. You can't ask a brain in survival mode to engage in cognitive restructuring, emotional labeling, or insight-based reflection. The body must be safe before the mind can work. This is not a soft clinical preference. It is a neurobiological reality, and polyvagal theory gives us the framework to understand why. The autonomic nervous system functions as the brain's foundational safety detection system. When it registers threat, whether that threat is a genuinely dangerous situation or a sensory environment that's simply incompatible with the client's nervous system, the higher cognitive functions of the prefrontal cortex go offline. Thinking, reflecting, and connecting become physiologically inaccessible. For autistic women, the sensory environment of a standard clinical setting can trigger exactly this response before a single word of therapy is spoken. A clock, buzzing fluorescent lights, scratchy upholstery, the sounds of the waiting room, these are not minor inconveniences. For a nervous system wired toward heightened sensory processing, they register as threat. Cognitive intervention in that environment is not just ineffective, it's clinically inappropriate. This is why the first practical task of neurodiversity-affirming therapy is building an individualized sensory profile with each client. What specific sensory inputs are activating for her nervous system? What reduces activation? What helps her return to a regulated state quickly when she is dysregulated in real-world settings? The therapist works with her to develop tools, but these tools require thoughtful adaptation for real-world use. For example, a cold instant ice pack pressed against the vagus nerve at the right side of the neck to trigger a rapid heart rate reduction. These somatic tools send a direct biological signal to the brain. The environment is safe enough to resume functioning. So this is the foundation. Everything else is built on top of it. Standard evidence-based modalities like DBT, EMDR, and ACT can be genuinely effective for the anxiety, depression, and trauma that accompany autism, but each one requires meaningful adaptation to work with autistic neurology rather than against it. The tools themselves are not the problem. The neurotypical assumptions built into them are, and those assumptions can be changed. So standard DBT operates on a skill deficit model, the assumption that the client hasn't learned to regulate her emotions and the therapist's job is to teach her. But neurodiversity affirming DBT operates on a skill difference model instead. The autistic client may already have a sophisticated regulatory toolkit: deep pressure, movement, stimming, specific sensory inputs that reliably bring her nervous system back into balance. The problem is not that she lacks skills, it's that she has been shamed out of using them. Neurodiversity affirming DBT explicitly gives her back permission. It can also address alexithymia directly, providing somatic anchors and an emotional language shared with her therapist rather than using a neurotypical template. EMDR is uniquely suited to autistic trauma for one important reason: it does not require words. Standard talk therapy that asks a client to verbally narrate her trauma in detail can inadvertently trigger the very shutdown it's trying to address. So, evidence-based EMDR sidesteps this by using bilateral stimulation, like with tappers, to tax the working memory while simultaneously downregulating the amygdala. That mechanism mirrors REM sleep when the brain naturally integrates emotional residue. The client can process the physiological weight of a traumatic memory without needing to construct a verbal account of it first. The key adaptation for autistic clients is ensuring EMDR targets the specific traumas unique to the autistic experience. So, the chronic masking, the accumulated social rejections, the sensory events the nervous system encoded as life-threatening, rather than focusing solely on more conventional trauma histories. Acceptance and commitment therapy offers a values-based framework for building a meaningful life despite ongoing difficulty. Its core tools are powerful, but standard ACT relies heavily on cognitive diffusion exercises that can overwhelm a client in sensory burnout, requiring executive function that simply may not be available. So adapted ACT integrates compassion-focused therapy and begins with somatic grounding rather than cognitive analysis. It acknowledges that for a client in genuine sensory pain, that pain is not merely a thought to be observed and released, it is a neurological reality. From that acknowledgement, the work moves toward identifying the client's core values and finding practical, sensory-safe ways to act in alignment with them. The sequence, body first, values second, action third, respects both the reality of the autistic experience and the client's genuine capacity for a self-directed life. Motivational interviewing is adapted by utilizing concrete, literal language and allowing extended processing time to help clients navigate ambivalence and select goals that align with their authentic personal values rather than neurotypical standards. Emotion-focused therapy adapts by employing embodied language and sensation-based emotion charts to assist clients with alexithymia in recognizing and labeling visceral bodily changes before they escalate into meltdowns. Family systems therapy is adapted by positioning the therapist as an interpreter to bridge the double empathy gap and reconceptualizing traditional dynamics. Across all these modalities, the organizing principle is the same one we established in the previous slide: regulation before cognition. The body must be safe before the mind can work, and the person must be met where she actually is, not where a manual assumes she should be. One of the most practical and most frequently overlooked dimensions of neurodiversity-affirming care is the willingness to rethink the basic structure of therapy itself. The standard therapy hour once a week was designed around assumptions about processing speed, communication style, and cognitive readiness that simply do not apply to many autistic clients. Adapting that structure is foundational to whether therapy is accessible at all. So let's start with time. Current research indicates that autistic adults often require significantly longer to build a therapeutic alliance and may need twice as many total sessions as neurotypical clients to achieve equivalent benefit. This is not a reflection of treatment resistance or slower progress. It reflects the reality that an autistic woman entering a therapy room often requires substantial time just to settle, to allow her nervous system to regulate, to release the accumulated tension of navigating the journey there, and to shift from a state of hypervigilance into one where genuine engagement is actually possible. Some clients find that sessions of 90 minutes to 2 hours are meaningfully more effective for this reason. And then other clients benefit from a structured 5-minute processing break mid-session. which is just a pause that removes the pressure to respond immediately and allows the client to formulate her thoughts without the social urgency of a conversational silence. Pacing within sessions matters just as much as overall length. Therapists are encouraged to monitor the client's cognitive load in real time and slow down when signs of overwhelm appear, rather than continuing to introduce new material or press for responses. And the 10-minute warning before a session ends is not a minor courtesy. For an autistic client who has finally reached a state of genuine engagement, an abrupt transition out of the session can be genuinely destabilizing. Advance notice allows her to begin the cognitive work of preparing to shift. Transition boundaries at the end of sessions deserve particular attention. As we discussed in the structural accommodation section, the standard expectation that a client will simply stand up and walk out when the session ends may not honor the reality of what transition actually costs her nervous system. Communication accommodations are equally significant. Spoken language can be genuinely exhausting for autistic people, particularly during periods of high emotional distress, sensory overload, or shutdown. Clinicians should actively invite clients to write or draw their thoughts during sessions rather than relying solely on verbal speech. This is not a workaround for a deficit. It's just an alternative communication pathway that may be more neurologically accessible and therefore more therapeutically productive than spoken words alone. The research describes email or text check-ins between sessions as invaluable. Autistic clients often continue processing insights long after the session ends, and the moment a thought crystallizes may be exactly the moment it needs to be captured before it's lost to the cognitive demands of daily life. So an email journal, which, entries written between sessions and brought into the next appointment to explore together, extends the therapeutic container beyond the clinical hour in a way that can be practical and deeply affirming. And it communicates to the client that your processing matters even when I'm not in the room with you. Written session summaries provided by the therapist after each appointment could serve a similar function, giving the client something concrete to return to, reducing the anxiety of trying to hold the session's content in memory, and providing a reference point if something from the session was misunderstood or requires clarification. The goal is not to simplify the work. It is to remove unnecessary barriers to it and to ensure that the rules of engagement within the session itself are as explicit, predictable, and navigable as the physical environment that we worked so hard to create. The physical environment of therapy is not neutral. For an autistic nervous system, the sensory and structural features of a clinical setting communicate before a single word is spoken whether the space is safe. And as we've established across this series, a nervous system that is defending against threat cannot simultaneously engage in self-reflection, emotional processing, or relational risk. Getting the environment right is not preparation for the clinical work, it is clinical work. A useful starting point is what researchers call a sensory audit, a deliberate collaborative assessment of the therapy room through the client's sensory experience rather than the clinician's. The lights, the sounds, the temperature, the smells, the textures, these details can matter, and the clinician who asks about them communicates something important. Your sensory experience of this room is a legitimate clinical concern. Seating arrangements deserve particular attention. The traditional face-to-face configuration creates an implicit and continuous demand for eye contact that functions as an accessibility barrier for many autistic clients. Side-by-side seating, angled chairs, or the option to sit on the floor are not unconventional indulgences. They remove a significant source of cognitive load and allow the client to direct her attention inward rather than spending it managing the social performance of sustained eye contact. Walk and talk therapy, conducting sessions while moving side by side outdoors, achieves a similar effect while adding the regulatory benefits of movement and natural sensory input, producing a meaningful shift in what becomes clinically possible. A standard waiting room with shared seating, ambient noise, unpredictable foot traffic, and the accumulated social pressure of public space can spike a client's anxiety high enough that her cognitive resources are significantly depleted before the session begins. The research indicates that telehealth is highly valued in this population precisely because it allows the client to engage from a regulated baseline rather than an already depleted one. So structural predictability, the consistent room layout, the same appointment time each week, a visual agenda, this can help function as attachment theory describes it as a holding environment. It reduces the ambient intolerance of uncertainty that generates baseline anxiety, and it allows the client to cognitively prepare for the session in advance rather than encountering it as an unpredictable social situation she must navigate in real time. Finally, sensory tools should be present and explicitly normalized in the therapy room, including fidget toys, weighted blankets, noise-canceling headphones. These are legitimate self-regulatory tools that support nervous system regulation and, by extension, therapeutic engagement. Their presence in the room, offered without comment or qualification, communicates a powerful clinical message. Your body's needs are welcome here. Taken together, these accommodations are not modifications to therapy. They are the conditions under which therapy for this population actually becomes possible. Even when the nervous system is regulated and the therapeutic relationship is safe, autistic women face a set of daily functional challenges that therapy must address directly, rather than labeling them as non-compliant or treatment-interfering behavior. Executive dysfunction is one of the most significant and least accommodated features of autistic neurology. Executive functioning is the brain's management system, responsible for working memory, task initiation, cognitive flexibility, and planning. In the autistic phenotype, this system operates on a fundamentally different framework, often driven by what researchers call monotropism, which is a tendency toward deep, single-channel focus that makes broad, simultaneous processing genuinely difficult. What this looks like clinically is maybe a client who arrives late to sessions, consistently forgets to complete therapeutic worksheets, struggles to plan her week, or cannot initiate tasks that she genuinely wants to do. The traditional clinical response has too often been to interpret these patterns as resistance, low motivation, or disengagement. This interpretation is not only inaccurate, it's harmful. It compounds the shame the client already carries about her functional challenges and damages the therapeutic alliance. The neurodiversity-affirming response is to restructure the clinical scaffolding entirely. This includes adapting the standard SMART goal framework, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound, to better fit autistic neurology. So in neurodiversity affirming practice, the M shifts from measurable to meaningful, ensuring goals align with the client's genuine values and interests rather than external standards. The A shifts from achievable to adaptive, building in flexibility for the reality that capacity varies significantly day to day. Energy accounting takes this further, offering a concrete daily tracking tool for managing executive load. The premise is simple but transformative. Different activities cost different amounts of cognitive and sensory energy, and each person wakes up with a finite amount available. For example, a family dinner might cost 8 units. A therapy session might cost 4. A work day with a difficult meeting might cost 12 units of energy. When a client can visually map her energy expenditure against her available resources, The moral judgment evaporates. She's not lazy, she's not unmotivated. Her battery is depleted, and she can see exactly why. Practical support is also in the neurodiversity affirming framework, genuine clinical care. Helping a client draft a letter requesting workplace accommodations is not outside the scope of therapy. It is an expression of unconditional positive regard. It demonstrates in action that the therapist sees her whole life as worthy of support, not just the interior work done within the therapy hour. Advocacy is care, and for many autistic women, practical scaffolding in the real world is what makes the insights gained in the therapy room sustainable. Everything we have covered in this episode and across this entire series has been building towards this: the possibility of a life that no longer requires the mask. Identity integration is the long-term horizon of neurodiversity affirming therapy. It is the gradual supported process through which an autistic woman moves from experiencing her neurology as a source of shame and deficit to experiencing it as a coherent, valid, and genuinely valued part of who she is. This does not happen quickly. It does not happen through a single intervention. It happens through the accumulated experience of being in a therapeutic relationship where she is consistently treated as the expert on her own life, where her regulatory behaviors are validated rather than suppressed, where her intense interests are recognized as strengths rather than symptoms, and where the narrative of her life is gradually reauthored from "I am broken" to "I was never given the right conditions." A strengths-based lens is essential to this work. Current research identifies 5 self-reported strength domains in autistic women: cognitive and pattern recognition strengths, character strengths including deep loyalty and honesty, creative and artistic gifts, academic depth and intellectual intensity, and interpersonal strengths including a capacity for empathy that, as we established in episode 1, is not absent but often overwhelming in its intensity. A strengths diary can be used clinically as a regular reflective practice, helping the client build an evidence base for her own competence, counteracting the internalized ableism accumulated over decades of deficit framing. Monotropism, the deep single-channel focus often framed as a clinical liability, reframes beautifully in a strengths-based context. The ability to sustain extraordinary depth of engagement with a subject of genuine interest is not a restricted behavior. It is a cognitive gift. And therapeutic work that connects to a client's genuine interests and values is not just more engaging, it is neurologically more accessible. Connecting with an autistic woman's internal world means moving beyond just allowing autistic traits to actually celebrating them. But perhaps the most powerful therapeutic intervention this research identifies is one that happens outside the therapy room, and that is an autistic-led peer community. When an autistic woman finds herself surrounded by people who share her neurotype, the double empathy problem dissolves. She does not have to explain her communication style, apologize for her sensory needs, or translate herself into a language the room finds easier to process. The constant, exhausting cognitive pressure of performing neurotypicality finally ends. Authentic belonging becomes possible, perhaps for the first time. The research describes this in terms of social validity, the radical question of who gets to define what a good clinical outcome looks like. Historically, the answer has been the neurotypical majority. Did she learn to make eye contact? Did she stop rocking in public? Did she learn to make small talk? But if achieving those milestones requires masking that leads directly to burnout and suicidality, they are not good outcomes. They are catastrophic ones dressed in the language of success. A truly valid outcome in the neurodiversity affirming framework is defined entirely by the autistic woman herself. Is she experiencing less sensory pain? Does she have sustainable functioning that honors her actual energy? Is she building a life around her genuine values rather than neurotypical expectations? Is she finally becoming more fully herself? That is the metric and the destination. We have covered extraordinary ground across this final episode and across this entire series. We arrived at the place this entire series has been pointing towards: identity integration, authentic belonging, and the possibility of a life no longer organized around the performance of neurotypicality. I want to close by naming what I hope this series has offered. Whether you're a clinician, a graduate student, or someone who has recognized your own experience, the most important shift this research invites is not a new technique, but a fundamental reorientation in how you understand the person across from you. She is not a collection of deficits to be reduced. She is not non-compliant, resistant, or difficult. She is a person who has been navigating a world that was not built for her, often without language for her own experience, without accurate diagnosis, and without the kind of care this series has been describing. Your role is not to fix her. It is to provide the conditions in which she can finally, safely become more fully herself. And for anyone who has heard their own story in these episodes, the decades of masking, the exhaustion, the diagnostic labels that never quite fit, the profound loneliness of moving through the world feeling fundamentally alien, I want to offer this. The research is catching up to your experience. The field is changing, and the most important thing this body of work says to you is not a clinical recommendation. It's something far simpler and far more significant. You were never broken. Thank you for being here for all 4 episodes.